This episode contains discussions about death, embalming, and animal experimentation. If these subjects are triggering for you, this may be a good episode to skip. Humans are fascinated by gore and violence, but even more so the mysterious and unsolved. Interest in these disturbing and unpleasant subjects is called morbid curiosity, and it has gripped millions of people throughout the ages. I am one of those people. My name is Hallie, and this is the Morbid Curiosity Podcast. The fear of death is quite a natural thing. The idea of ceasing to exist is quite unsettling, as is thinking about our flesh rotting away in the pitch blackness of a small box buried 6 feet under the earth. But even more horrifying is the thought of being buried in that box while still alive. Stories of premature burial, also known as live burial or vivisepulture, have circulated throughout history. Reports of people waking up in a coffin as they're lowered into the grave, or passers-by hearing screams and knocking coming from the cemetery, appear across history, but proliferated from the mid-1700s onward. One of the most common reports was that after someone had died and was buried, the gravedigger, or perhaps a thief, attempted to rob the corpse of valuables by digging them up. When they touched the corpse to remove jewelry, it sat up and screamed, scaring the thief out of their wits. The fear of being buried alive is called taphophobia, and it applies to all types of premature burial, by freak accident, as a form of punishment or execution, which is known as immurement, and by medical mistake. Taphophobia is one of the most common phobias among humans, and there's little wonder why. Being buried alive completely takes away all agency, all control over our own fate, all while almost guaranteeing our death. Premature burial can lead to death in a number of ways, including asphyxiation, dehydration, starvation, and in cold climates, hypothermia. If trapped without fresh air to breathe, death can occur within a few minutes. A person trapped with a source of fresh air can last a considerable time. In such cases, if the person is not rescued, they will perish of dehydration within 2 to 5 days, depending on the climate. If they have some access to water but are still not found, death by starvation will occur within 8 to 20 days. While freak accidents and immurement are rare, they are more common these days than medical mistakes that result in a patient being buried alive. Due to modern medical technology, such as EKG to measure the heart rate and EEGs that measure brain activity, physicians today can easily determine if a patient is dead or in some sort of suspended state, like a coma. However, this technology is fairly recent. Before these inventions, physicians could never be 100% sure that their patients were dead. That is, unless they waited for the body to begin decaying, a very smelly process called putrefaction. Because of this, it is very likely that premature burial occurred far more often then than it does today. People knew this and were quite alarmed and afraid, especially in the late 18th to early 20th century. During this time frame, the world was constantly plagued with pandemics from diseases such as cholera, bubonic plague, smallpox, yellow fever, measles, malaria, and typhoid. While we have life-saving vaccines for these diseases today, at the time, millions of deaths occurred with no understanding as to why. Humans were powerless against the onslaught of pathogens. Mass death due to contagious disease often results in hurried burial of the dead in order to avoid the disease spreading any further. Rushing to bury the dead might cause the living to miss signs of life. Cholera victims especially often fell into what we now know as comas, but at the time they were presumed to be dead. Along with severe outbreaks of disease, the concept of health and the practice of medicine were rapidly changing. Previously, a person was either alive or dead. There weren't any gray areas. Most physicians didn't pronounce patients dead. They tended to abandon the patients who they deemed critically ill or a lost cause, leaving their families to care for them in their last days. Nor was it common for a physician to examine a body after death and officially declare the person deceased. Many times, all the family could do was wait for the body to begin to decay. As medicine and science began to advance, treatment moved away from the home and into hospitals, with the public having to trust the expertise of physicians. During the Victorian era, which went from 1837 to 1901, physicians began to distinguish several bodily conditions that seemed to hover between life and death. Many new words were used to describe these states, such as coma, suspended animation, hibernation, syncope, catalepsy, and trance. These terms were also not fixed and were used often interchangeably to describe different conditions. This ambiguity both reflected and reinforced the idea that death as a condition was more complicated than previously thought. The discovery and rise of chloroform and ether during surgery added to the confusion. While they were excellent in reducing pain and awareness during surgery, they rendered the patient unconscious, a state which they would eventually revive from but could be confused with death. There was also the possibility that they were actually dead, as too much of either substance can kill the patient. The incidence of chloroform-related deaths was uncertain, as there was no way to determine if chloroform or surgery had killed the patient. Other medical advances, like resuscitation via CPR after drowning, also complicated things. In some instances, it was now possible to revive someone who appeared dead. This brought about deep confusion over human physiology, with physicians wondering why some people could be resuscitated and some couldn't, and how the brain and lungs interacted in such cases. Even more confusing, the medical field was not of one mind when it came to what constituted death. Recent advances in resuscitation seemed to indicate that pulse and breath were not actually essential to life, as they could stop for a period of time and then resume. This prompted many physicians to believe that new criteria for what constituted as death were required. On the other side, some physicians believed that pulse and breath were essential to life, but were sometimes reduced so much as to be undetectable. Many animal experiments were undertaken by both factions trying to determine the connection between the brain, the heart, and the lungs, and how a reduction in their function affected the body, much to the detriment of many small animals. Scientific experiments with electricity showed it could be used to stimulate movement in a corpse, but could not resuscitate it. Both physicians and the public were confused and uneasy about the boundary between life and death. It was no longer an easy call to make, and members of the public didn't trust physicians to make it. On top of this, coroners often refused to exhume corpses in suspected cases of premature burial. They saved that process for criminal cases in which a re-examination of the body was required. Waiting for putrefaction remained the only foolproof way to determine that someone was really dead. But waiting for a relative to start decaying wasn't hygienic or practical. People needed a way to know for sure that their loved ones were dead before they buried them. Various gruesome methods of testing for death appeared. These included tobacco smoke enemas, putting red-hot pokers on the skin or in various orifices, yanking on the tongue or nipples with pliers, administering shocks, and urine mouthwashes. It was also recommended that the body be placed in an environment that encouraged decomposition, and then to wait and watch. This last method was the most reliable and least cruel, so in 18th century France and Germany, it was put into widespread practice. Waiting mortuaries, or Leichenhaus in German, popped up all over the place. Corpses were placed in these large facilities to wait for putrefaction to set in. Some were attached to bells or other apparatus which would ring if they moved, alerting the staff that someone had been mistaken for dead. Surprisingly, the British had nothing like this. Most British people, especially the poor, already kept the bodies of their loved ones at home for extended periods. This was both to make sure they were dead and to assure that the body would be of no use to anatomists, who were known to hire body snatchers to steal corpses for their dissections, a topic we covered in a previous episode. After decades of these waiting mortuaries, German physicians admitted that nobody had actually ever revived in such an institution. The repulsive tests for death continued, despite the invention of the stethoscope in 1846 by French physician Eugene Boucher. The absence of a final check by a competent person for signs of life led to widespread fears of premature burial. Victorian doctors were confused, often careless, and sometimes accused of being cruel. They were not in a position to reassure the public that they knew death when they saw it. No one test for death, other than the slow and unpleasant wait for decay, was definitive. In 1896, the London Association for the Prevention of Premature Burial was founded and organized public fear into a political movement. Blending middle-class unease over Britain's lax death certification standards with residual working-class fears of body snatching by anatomists, the LAPPB publicized the hazards of a hasty interment. They filled mailboxes with pamphlets, pestered Parliament, and recruited its own corps of physicians to verify end of life. The association campaigned for improvements in death certification and for the building of safety coffins with warning devices that called attention to the situation of those interred. I'll get to these after the ad break. Reports of premature burial skyrocketed. Some of these reports were legitimate, but many were carbon copies of previous reports. Others were complete fantasy and dissolved under close scrutiny. The panic surrounding misdiagnosed death was sustained by groups like the LAPPD, who made the situation seem more dire than it was. Premature burial was a real issue, but it wasn't as common as they proclaimed it to be. Modern estimates suggest that only around 2% of those buried were buried prematurely in the 19th century. This percentage was higher in times of pestilence and war. 2% is still thousands of people, and public concern over premature burial did result in burial reforms. I'm going to go over safety coffins and other ways people tried to protect themselves from premature burial. But first, an ad must play. If you find these ads annoying, you can get ad-free episodes by becoming an MCP patron on Patreon for as little as $2 a month. Paying a little more per month will also grant you access to outtakes, monthly quizzes, meditations, videos, and more. If you'd rather not become a patron, you can also give one-time and monthly donations to the podcast through our Ko-fi page at ko-fi.com/MCP. Every little bit helps, and we are eternally grateful for your support. The fear of being buried alive peaked during the cholera epidemics of the 19th century. These fears were heightened by the multitude of accounts in the newspapers and chapbooks, as well as popular horror fiction dealing with the subject, such as Edgar Allan Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher, The Cask of Amontillado, and The Premature Burial. With the public in a panic, many inventions arose to aid those affected by premature burial. Before I get into safety coffins, I'd like to share a few of the more drastic measures people took to make sure they weren't buried alive. There was a push for above-ground mortuary vaults instead of underground burials, the keys to which would be placed in a spot easily discovered by anyone who woke up within. Many people left instructions in their wills for family to remove their heads or hearts, pierce their hearts with needles, or open their veins before burial to ensure they didn't wake up in their coffins. Others requested a method of killing themselves to be placed in the coffin, such as poison or a knife. Cremation was recommended by some experts. To quote Sir Henry Thompson, the first president of the Cremation Society of England, which was founded in 1874, cremation would, quote, render death instantaneous and painless, if by any unhappy chance an individual so circumstanced were submitted to it." End quote. He also mentioned that the inspection that occurs before cremation would likely catch any signs of life. A less grim and more life-saving solution was the security coffin, also called the safety coffin. Various designs appeared in the 19th century, but most allowed the mistakenly buried to communicate with the world above ground, as well as sustain life underground. In the United States, at least 22 patents for security coffins were filed between 1868 and 1925. Over 30 were patented in Germany in the second half of the 19th century, where the fear was apparently greatest. Most models included an air tube and a communication device that allowed the mistakenly buried and presumably terrified individual in the coffin to alert the living to their plight. Common communication devices included a bell, a horn, or a flag that could be activated from inside the coffin. One model allowed for launching a firecracker through the coffin's air tube. Several came equipped with a shovel, a rather impractical addition, seeing as the entombed couldn't move. The first recorded safety coffin was constructed for Duke Ferdinand of Brunswick before his death in 1792. He had a window near the head of the coffin for light, an air tube, and instead of the lid being nailed down, it was locked with a lock that was accessible from the inside. A key was placed in a pocket of his shroud. P.G. Pessler, a German priest, suggested in 1798 that all coffins should have cords running through a tube system that, when pulled, could ring the church bells. While this idea was complicated and impractical, it did inspire the first safety coffin designs with signaling systems. A colleague of Pessler's, Pastor Beck, suggested that coffins should have a way to check for putrefaction by scent, a small tube that stuck up from the coffin and emanated the odors of decay. If no odor was detected after a certain time, or cries for help were heard from the tube, the coffin could be exhumed and the occupant rescued. In 1829, Dr. Johann Gottfried Taberger designed a system using a bell. The corpse would have strings attached to its hands, head, and feet that ran up to a bell above the ground. Any movement would trigger it to ring. A housing around the bell prevented it from ringing due to wind or birds landing on it. The housing also prevented rainwater from running down the air tube, and netting over the tube prevented insects from entering it. If the bell rang, the cemetery watchman was to insert a second tube and pump air into the coffin with a bellows to allow the occupant to survive until the coffin was exhumed. One of the earliest American patents for a safety coffin was filed in 1843 by Christian H. Eisenbrandt of Baltimore, Maryland. The coffin featured a spring-loaded lid that would snap open at the slightest movement. The coffin was meant to be interred in an above-ground vault, and a key to the vault door should be left next to it. Advertisements for Eisenbrandt's Jack-in-the-Box coffin date to 1944 and definitely play up the idea that premature burial was common and that his device was necessary. In 1868, Franz Vester of Newark, New Jersey, filed a patent for his improved burial case, which was an elaborate variation on earlier bell and cord systems. It featured a narrow tube with a ladder that allowed a reanimated person to climb to safety. If the buried individual was too weak to escape on their own, they could also pull a rope inside the coffin that rang a bell above the ground to alert the living. There was also a viewing window at the top of the tube, so people could look for signs of putrefaction. The viewing tube could be removed and reused once it was sure that the occupant was dead. Vester gave demonstrations of his coffins, which were reported on in the New York Times in 1868. Vester had himself buried in his security coffin under 4 feet of dirt. He emerged after an hour to applause from an amazed crowd. On the 5th of December, 1882, J.G. Kriegbaum patented his device for life in buried persons. It consisted of a movable periscope that provided air and, when rotated or pushed by the occupant, indicated to passers-by that someone was buried alive. In 1897, Count Michel de Karnitze-Karnicki, allegedly a chamberlain to Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, patented his own safety coffin called La Karnitze, and, like Vester, toured Europe and the US promoting it. A spring-loaded device sitting on the occupant's chest would be triggered if the chest began to move. The spring would open a box on the surface, admitting air through a tube into the coffin. To summon help, a flag would also spring up, a bell would ring for 30 minutes, and a lamp would be lit. To show its effectiveness, the Count would ask for volunteers to be buried alive. To this day, the world record for the longest voluntary live burial is held by an Italian man named Faroppo Lorenzo, who consented to be entombed in Le Carnizze for 9 days in 1898. Unfortunately, a similar demonstration ended poorly when the signaling system failed. Thankfully, the breathing tube still activated, meaning the occupant survived, but Le Carnizze was quickly forgotten. One of the most popular safety devices in Victorian England was the Battison revival device, invented by George Battison. Nicknamed Battison's Belfry, the device consisted of an iron bell mounted on the coffin lid just above the deceased's head, with a cord connected to the hand. Simple and efficient, the device sold well, and Battison made a fortune in sales. However, Battison's own all-consuming fear of premature burial eventually drove him mad, and in 1886 he fatally doused himself with oil and set himself on fire. In 1890, Thomas Purcell, a local firefighter, built a burial vault for his family at Wildwood Cemetery in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, with an internal hatch to allow the victim of premature burial to escape. The vault also had an air supply and was lined with felt to prevent injury to panic-stricken victims before their escape. Those placed in the vault were removed from their caskets beforehand. There have been 6 other vaults built in surrounding cemeteries based on Purcell's original design. American doctor Timothy Clark Smith was so afraid of being buried alive that he designed and then built a whole tomb for himself. This grave continues to intrigue those who visit Evergreen Cemetery in New Haven, Vermont. The tomb includes a set of stairs, a bell to ring, a hammer and chisel, an air tube, and a window at the top of a cement shaft above the deceased's head, so that people could make sure Dr. Clark was decomposing. He died and was buried in his tomb in 1893, and the window is still open today, although all you can see is condensation and darkness. Despite all the energy put toward inventing and building such devices, there are no documented cases of anybody being saved by a safety coffin. One design flaw of many safety coffins is the fact that corpses can sometimes move or even flip over during decomposition. Ligaments dry out, pulling the limbs out of burial position, and bloat due to gas buildup can release unexpectedly, causing the body to shift positions. This was recently confirmed during an experiment at the Australian Facility for Taphonomic Experimental Research, which utilized time-lapse cameras to test a scientific equation for estimating decomposition rates in human bodies. These post-mortem movements would have set safety coffin bells ringing, causing a false alarm. A false alarm could be very expensive, as the grave would have to be excavated only to find the occupant was indeed deceased. More importantly, it could be quite traumatic for the family of the deceased, as well as heartbreaking, since the ringing bell would have given them hope that their loved one was alive. This issue was a serious design flaw, and suggests that the coffins probably wouldn't have worked properly if they were actually used. While there were many patents for security coffins, most patents for coffin technology between 1855 and 1896 were centered on keeping the casket airtight, deodorizing the corpse, or making sure both the body and the casket were fully combustible for a complete cremation. Today, most deceased individuals are embalmed, a process by which the body is drained of blood and infused with a formaldehyde-based preservative chemical. This is usually done through a small incision on the right side of the neck, which allows access to the carotid artery and jugular vein. A tube is inserted into the carotid artery and embalming fluid is pumped in. Another tube is inserted into the jugular vein to drain any excess fluid. An instrument called a trocar is used to both remove body fluid and run embalming fluid into the organs. As you can see, the process involves a lot of interaction with the corpse by the embalmer, who would notice immediately if the person was still alive. Therefore, for the most part, this process has eliminated the fear of premature burial. Despite the incidence of unintentional live burial being overestimated in the past, it did happen occasionally. Thanks to funerary reforms spurred by the fear of premature burial, we now have very specific criteria for certifying death, which can be confirmed by medical technology that can determine exactly when the brain and heart shut down for good. Today, clinical death is defined as the cessation of blood circulation and breathing. However, both can sometimes be restored by CPR, defibrillation, and epinephrine injections. Most tissues and organs of the human body can survive clinical death for a considerable period. The brain, however, cannot go long without blood supply, and a loss of function can occur even if circulation is recovered. Full recovery of the brain after more than 3 minutes of clinical death is rare. Legal death occurs when recovery efforts are unsuccessful. A person who is determined to be brain dead can be pronounced legally dead without clinical death occurring. So even today, death is complicated. It's now considered a series of physical events, not just a single moment. There are also many forms of death, but it's agreed that physical death of the human body occurs when the heart stops beating, the lungs stop breathing, and the blood stops circulating, and none can be recovered. Interestingly, in the modern age, our fear of premature burial has transformed into something more like hope. We hope for a mistake that means death hasn't occurred. Death is so obvious and certain these days that when someone wakes up after being declared dead, it's thought of as more of a medical miracle than a tragedy. In this vein of thought, I'll leave you with an uplifting story of premature burial. On September 1st, 1937, Angel Hayes crashed his motorcycle in Saint-Quentin-des-Chalets in France. He went face first into a brick wall and was pronounced dead at the scene. His face was so deformed that his family wasn't allowed to see the corpse, and the funeral was closed casket. 3 days after the accident, he was buried. Suspicious elements came to light between his death and the burial. Hayes' father had taken out a $200,000 life insurance policy on him just 2 weeks before the crash. Suspecting foul play, insurance investigators wanted a full autopsy, toxicology, and analysis on the body, none of which had occurred before his burial. Therefore, Hayes was exhumed 2 days after the funeral. To everyone's surprise, the body was warm and no signs of decay were present. Hayes had been in a coma. His body had needed very little oxygen to sustain itself. He was rushed to the hospital and revived immediately. Hayes eventually made a full recovery. After his ordeal, he invented a special coffin that could sustain a human for several days in the event of a premature burial like his own. The coffin had a radio transmitter, a chemical toilet, a small fridge, small oven, and a cassette player. In 1974, Hayes demonstrated the use of the coffin at an inventions exposition by being buried in it for 30 hours. In another exposition in 1984, he survived for 2 days. He became a minor celebrity and lived to the ripe old age of 90. So, if you have a fear of premature burial, there is a safety coffin that truly seems to work. Hopefully, this alleviates your fear somewhat. Until next time, keep tending to your spark of morbid curiosity. The The Morbid Curiosity Podcast is produced by H. Lloyd. If you'd like to get in touch or suggest a morbid topic, you can do so on Facebook and Instagram at Morbid Curiosity Podcast or on our website, www.morbidcuriositypodcast.com. If you like the podcast, please share it with your friends and give us a rating on whatever podcast app you use. This helps the MCP reach new listeners and expand this wonderfully creepy community. Thank you to everyone who has already done so. Because of you, the listeners, our creepy community is growing strong. The MCP has joined the Straight Up Strange podcast network, which hosts true crime, paranormal, history, science, folklore, and other enigmatic podcasts. Nothing is off limits when you enter the world of Straight Up Strange. The MCP is also part of the Belfry Podcast Network, a haven for goth culture featuring podcasts, blogs, and videos, all catering to the darker side of life. If you'd like to support the MCP but would rather not become a patron, you can give one-time donations on our website and our Ko-fi page. Also on our website are links to all our social media, a full list of episodes, links to our merch, and our mailing list. We also have an Amazon wish list at bit.ly/morbidwishlist. That's bit.ly/morbidwishlist. Any purchases from this list are greatly appreciated. We are eternally grateful for your support. My name is Hallie, and until next time, thanks for listening.